Tonight, we begin with a development that is not just about what Ukraine can hit, but about who Russia says is really pulling the trigger. Because in the span of just days, we've watched Ukraine's long-range campaign reach deep into Russian territory again, toward the Moscow region, with drones that Russian air defenses say they are repeatedly shooting down, including a Moscow-bound drone intercepted today, and, according to Russian officials, an earlier burst of roughly 40 drones downed over the Moscow region in just a few hours last week. And if you want a marker for what deep inside Russia means in practical terms, consider what Ukraine said it struck on December 12th, the Slavneft Yanos oil refinery in Yaroslavl, roughly 250 kilometers northeast of Moscow, with industry sources telling Reuters that a primary processing unit and loading infrastructure were hit, and that output was suspended. An attack not at the front, not at the border, but at the economic plumbing that keeps the Russian state funded and functioning. Now, anyone watching this war knows that these kinds of strikes have become a grim rhythm. Russia launches mass drone and missile barrages. Ukraine answers with long-range drones and sabotage-like precision. Both sides claim interceptions, damage, resilience. But what's different, what makes this the moment Moscow turned on Washington, is the way Russia's political messaging snaps into place whenever Ukraine demonstrates reach and effectiveness. The Kremlin moves quickly from Ukraine attacked us to the United States, and NATO are behind it. And it does that not as an incidental talking point, but as a strategic escalation of blame designed to transform the war rhetorically from a conflict with Ukraine into a confrontation with the West. We've seen this playbook before in stark form. After the alleged drone incident at the Kremlin in May 2023, Russia publicly shifted focus from Kyiv to Washington, with Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov saying decisions for attacks of that level are made not in Kyiv, but in Washington, a claim the United States rejected. And we've seen it in the warnings that followed when Ukraine sought or gained permission to use longer-range Western systems. In September 2024, the Kremlin explicitly framed any decision to allow strikes with long-range Western missiles as deepening direct involvement by the U.S. and Europe, and promised a response, again, not just condemning Ukraine, but building a case that Washington itself is now a party to the fight. That framing matters because it is not merely propaganda for domestic consumption. It becomes the pretext for Russia's diplomatic posture, its threat language, and its attempt to fracture Western unity by raising the cost, politically and psychologically, of supporting Ukraine. And it is landing in a moment when the broader diplomatic environment is already volatile. Major negotiations in Berlin are underway. Ukraine's leadership is openly discussing trade-offs that would have been unthinkable earlier in the war, including President Zelensky signaling a willingness to drop Ukraine's NATO ambition in exchange for binding security guarantees, an extraordinary concession, and one that intersects directly with Moscow's long-running demand that Ukraine remain outside NATO. So set the scene. Peace talks in one European capital, drones streaking toward another, and in Moscow, the steady drumbeat of "This isn't Ukraine, this is America," because that accusation serves multiple purposes at once, justifying retaliatory rhetoric, pressuring European publics, and reframing any Ukrainian battlefield success as illegitimate Western interference. Meanwhile, the operational reality underneath the politics is this. Ukraine has pursued a long-range strike strategy increasingly focused on Russia's energy and logistics networks, refineries, depots, transportation hubs, because in a war of endurance, the ability to squeeze the adversary's revenue, fuel supply, and repair capacity is a form of power. Reuters' own data work earlier this fall described a period in mid-August when drone strikes knocked out around 17% of Russia's refining capacity, rising to 21% by the end of that month by Reuters' calculations, with knock-on effects like price pressures and logistical reshuffling, meaning these strikes are not just symbolic, they can be economically disruptive. And Russia understands that, which is precisely why the Kremlin's instinct is to treat the method of attack as less important than the political story it can tell tell about the attack. America did this. It's the kind of accusation that turns every Ukrainian drone into a Western proxy weapon in Russian narrative terms. And it's why you see Russian officialdom leaning so hard on the concept of direct involvement, especially when strikes reach toward high-value areas like the Moscow region. But there's another layer here that makes the turned-on Washington piece feel sharper right now. Russia is trying to run two parallel tracks at once. One track that says, we are open to negotiations, we are reasonable, we are being pushed by the West, and another track that says NATO is preparing for war, NATO is the threat, which is why the Kremlin seized today on NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte's comments and called them irresponsible, casting Western leaders as reckless fearmongers even as Russia continues the war it began with its 2022 invasion. You can see the shape of the argument Moscow is building. Ukraine is not an independent actor. Therefore, Kyiv cannot be trusted in talks. The U.S. is the real adversary. Therefore, Washington must be pressured. Europe is being manipulated. Therefore, European unity must crack. And then, whenever Ukraine demonstrates a capability that shocks Russian defenses, whether a refinery strike deep in the interior or a sustained drone push toward Moscow, Russia's messaging hardens into that accusatory posture, turning outward to the United States because blaming Ukraine is not enough. Blaming the United States is leverage. That is the political logic. But the battlefield logic is equally consequential, and it has a feedback loop. Russian defenses claim interceptions and raise the number of drones downed. Ukraine claims hits and describes ongoing industrial impact, and the mere fact of repeated attempts, Moscow-bound drones, major refinery disruptions, forces Russia to spend, reposition, and adapt, which is part of the point. And then that adaptation feeds the Kremlin's rhetoric, because the costs of defending the interior become another argument for escalation, another reason to say the West has crossed a line, another justification to threaten consequences that are meant, in part, to frighten Western capitals into hesitation. The reason tonight feels like a moment is that these dynamics are colliding. Deep strikes are happening as diplomacy intensifies. Moscow is simultaneously dismissing NATO's warnings while claiming NATO is to blame. And Ukraine's long-range campaign is pushing the war into a space Russia has always insisted should be out of reach. Russia's rear, its refineries, its political center of gravity. And so the question is not whether Russia will complain. Russia will always complain. The question is what Russia is trying to achieve when it turns on Washington, because that move is not random outrage. It is strategy to raise the perceived cost of supporting Ukraine, to frame Ukrainian action as Western escalation, and to position the Kremlin as responding to America rather than being checked by Ukraine. The danger in that strategy is that it can become self-fulfilling. The more Russia insists it is at war with the West, the more it boxes itself into a posture where backing down looks like losing to the West. The more it casts Washington as the decision maker, the more it tempts itself to seek leverage against Washington through threats, cyber pressure, and rhetorical brinkmanship. And the more it tries to split Europe from the United States, the more it may provoke exactly the unity it claims to fear. So tonight, when you hear Ukraine strikes deep inside Russia, don't just think of the radius on a map. Think of the second sentence Russia adds right after, the sentence that matters to Moscow's broader plan. And therefore, this is Washington's fault, because that is how a drone strike becomes a diplomatic weapon. That is how a refinery fire becomes a narrative of Western aggression. And that is how the Kremlin tries to turn a war. It started into a war it claims is being done to it by the United States at the exact moment negotiators are attempting to figure out whether any kind of dignified peace, as Ukraine describes it, is even possible. And that is why this is a hinge moment, because as Ukraine demonstrates reach and Russia demonstrates rhetorical escalation, the space for miscalculation grows, the incentive for propaganda hardens, and the world is left watching two simultaneous contests, one over territory and infrastructure, and one over responsibility and blame, where the most important battlefield may not be the refinery or the drone corridor or the front line, but the story Moscow tells itself and the world about who it is really fighting and what it thinks it is allowed to do next.